Welcome to Sci-Fi Alien. Today, we're diving into a gripping tale that will make you question the very foundations of power and fear. Imagine standing face to face with an empire built on terror, ruled by a supreme warlord who's never been challenged. That's Zelora, a powerful leader who commands fear across galaxies, conquering civilizations and erasing species from existence. Her empire is untouchable until one human, a prisoner named Elias Vance, dares to defy her. Zelora, with all her might, expects Elias to cower before her, to beg for mercy. But instead, he stands unshaken, mocking her every move. "Why aren't you afraid?" she demands, her voice sharp with authority. His answer? "I've had worse Mondays." A simple line, yet it shakes her to the core. For the first time in her centuries of rule, Zelora is forced to question her greatest weapon: fear. How can a human, so insignificant in her eyes, stand unafraid before her? What is the power he holds that makes him immune to her rule? But Elias isn't just any prisoner. As the tension builds, a shocking revelation unfolds. Elias is not only defying Zelora's power, he's wielding a force beyond her comprehension, a force that could tear her empire apart. This isn't just about rebellion, it's about the unspoken truth that fear might not be the ultimate tool of power after all. What happens when the most feared warlord in the galaxy meets someone who isn't afraid to challenge everything she's built? Join us as we explore this thrilling clash of power, resilience, and the unexpected transformation of an empire. Trust us, you won't want to miss this. Zelora's reign was built on fear, an unshakable, ironclad foundation that held entire galaxies in a vice grip. For centuries, she had been a symbol of absolute power, an entity who wielded terror with such precision that no one dared to question her rule. Her name alone sent ripples of dread through the vast expanse of the galaxy, and the thought of crossing her was enough to send entire civilizations to their knees. Her warships, bristling with weapons of unimaginable destruction, hovered like dark specters over conquered worlds, a constant reminder that Defiance was not only futile, it was deadly. The planets she had crushed into submission bore her mark, remnants of their former glory reduced to ash and rubble. Entire species had been erased from existence, their cities reduced to smoking ruins. With a wave of her hand, Zelora could obliterate the very fabric of life, leaving behind only silence and the ghosts of those who had dared to live under her rule. It wasn't just power she possessed, it was the certainty that her control over fear was absolute. Fear was her greatest weapon, and she wielded it with cold efficiency. Zelora had learned long ago that fear could be the most effective tool in securing dominance. It was simple, raw, and primal. It didn't rely on diplomacy or subtle manipulation. Fear could be instilled in an instant, a single act of brutality capable of erasing all hope of resistance. And in the galaxy she ruled, that was all that mattered. She didn't need to be loved, adored, or respected. She needed to be feared. Fear kept her enemies at bay and her subordinates in line. It was a force that was not bound by time, by reason, or by mercy. Fear lingered long after the physical threat was gone, and in the case of Zelora, it lingered long enough to break any will to fight. Her empire, the Zeith Dominion, stretched across a vast expanse of space, a conglomerate of conquered worlds that bowed to her will. Zelora's generals, those loyal to her cause, operated with a precision that mirrored her own cold nature. They enforced her decrees, implemented her strategies, and ensured that fear was a constant presence in every corner of her dominion. But it wasn't just the scale of her conquests that made Zelora's rule so formidable, it was the way she carried herself, the unwavering confidence in her own invincibility. She walked through the halls of her flagship, the Exaltus, like a shadow cast over the galaxy, her obsidian black armor gleaming under the distant light of dying stars. Her crimson eyes, devoid of empathy, surveyed her domain with the calculating gaze of a predator. She wasn't just a leader, she was an omnipresent force. Her every decision, every movement, carried weight, and her presence was enough to quiet the most raucous of crowds and still the most defiant of hearts. To defy her was to invite annihilation. Her enemies had learned this lesson the hard way. Entire star systems had been reduced to dust by her hand, her warships devastating any who dared to challenge her. The concept of mercy was foreign to her. In her eyes, those who dared to oppose her didn't deserve it. They were weak, and weakness was a sin. Those who submitted to her rule were rewarded with survival, but those who resisted were erased without a second thought. Zelora's empire wasn't just a military dictatorship, it was a regime where fear permeated every aspect of life. It shaped the minds of those who lived under her reign, crafting a society where questioning authority was tantamount to treason. She had perfected the art of control, bending the will of entire species to her demands. Her soldiers, her warlords, and even her closest allies followed her not out of loyalty but out of fear of the consequences that would follow if they didn't. It was an effective system, one that had kept her on the throne for centuries. But what made Zelora's reign so terrifying wasn't just her ability to destroy, it was her ability to manipulate fear into a subtle, almost invisible force. Fear was everywhere, woven into the fabric of everyday life. It was in the hushed whispers of the oppressed, in the anxious glances exchanged behind closed doors, in the trembling hands of those who served her, waiting for their next command. Fear was her language, and everyone in her empire spoke it fluently. Despite her cold and calculated exterior, there was a certain loneliness that came with her reign. Zelora's relationship with fear was intimate. She understood it in ways no one else could. Fear was a constant companion, a shadow that walked with her wherever she went. But fear was also isolating. It separated her from others, kept her distant from the very subjects she ruled over. She ruled alone, a queen in a kingdom of submission, with no true companions, no equals. She was both the ruler and the monster, revered and reviled in equal measure. And so, Zelora's reign continued unchecked, with no one daring to challenge her until Elias Vance came into the picture. His arrival was a shift in the delicate balance she had carefully constructed. For the first time, Zelora found herself standing face to face with someone who wasn't afraid of her. It was a moment she couldn't fathom, someone, a mere human, standing unshaken before her might, mocking her authority, challenging her beliefs. In that moment, she realized something she had never considered before: fear, her greatest weapon, might not be as invincible as she thought. This realization, this crack in the armor of her certainty, would be the catalyst for everything that was to come. The foundations of her empire were built on the belief that fear was the ultimate power. Now, she would have to confront the terrifying possibility that she might have been wrong. Elias Vance was not the kind of man who cowered in the face of power. His story wasn't one of unrelenting strength or overwhelming force. It was a tale of resilience, of facing the inevitable with defiance, of laughing in the face of the impossible. He wasn't a hero forged in the fires of war or a man trained to be a warrior. Elias was, at his core, an ordinary human, but with an extraordinary understanding of the one thing that even the most powerful beings couldn't comprehend: fear. When he was captured by Zelora's forces, thrown into the cold, unforgiving depths of her warship, he had no delusions of survival. The odds were stacked against him, but that never mattered to him. What truly mattered was how he chose to face those odds. He understood that fear could be paralyzing, a force that controlled the weak and even the strong in ways that were often unseen, often unspoken. but he refused to let fear control him. Elias had lived through his own personal hells, experiences that had hardened his mind and spirit in ways most would never understand. He had known suffering, pain, loss, but it was this very suffering that had taught him the most important lesson of all: fear could only hold power over him if he allowed it. He had lived through nightmares, literal and metaphorical, and come out the other side with a bitter, wry smile. That smile was his shield against the terror that gripped those around him. When he stood before Zelora, bound by glowing alien restraints, surrounded by her warlords and soldiers, he didn't shrink. He didn't beg for his life. He stood tall, unaffected by the chaos of his situation. He wasn't defiant out of arrogance or ignorance, he was defiant because he had learned the secret: fear had no power unless you let it. Most would have seen the towering warlords, the gleaming obsidian armor of Zelora, and the oppressive weight of an entire empire in the air and faltered. But Elias didn't. His calmness, his lack of fear, was something foreign to them. It made Zelora uneasy in ways she couldn't quite understand. "Why aren't you afraid?" she demanded, her voice a sharp edge, a weapon that had brought entire worlds to their knees. The question was not just an inquiry, it was a challenge, a demand for submission. But Elias's response wasn't one of fear or pleading. "I've had worse Mondays." The words were simple, almost absurd in their casualness. But they weren't meant to mock her power. They were a declaration of something far more profound. In that moment, Elias wasn't just defying her, he was offering her a window into something she could never have anticipated: an existence without fear. This wasn't the response of a man who had been broken by suffering, nor was it the reaction of someone who had never felt fear. Elias knew fear intimately. He had faced it, had been engulfed by it at times, but he had learned to strip it of its power. He had witnessed the destruction of his world, the death of those he loved, and the emptiness that followed. But through it all, he had never allowed fear to consume him. It was not the absence of fear that made him strong, it was his ability to live with it, to acknowledge it, and still move forward. When Zelora saw his indifference, his unshakable calmness, something within her cracked. She had never met anyone like him, never encountered an enemy who did not buckle at the weight of her presence. Even her most loyal generals, her fiercest warriors, felt the cold grip of terror whenever she entered a room. But Elias Vance? He stood before her, not as an adversary filled with anger or vengeance, but as a man who had seen through the illusion of fear. He didn't need to defeat her, he just needed to show her that the very thing she relied upon to control everything, fear, was not the end-all and be-all she believed it to be. To Zelora, Elias was a paradox. He was just a human, someone who shouldn't have been capable of such unwavering defiance, yet there he was, standing as a living testament to everything she had ever believed about power being wrong. "Why aren't you afraid?" she repeated, but this time there was a note of confusion in her voice. She couldn't comprehend what she was seeing. This man, this mere human, was defying her in a way that no one else had. And Elias, with his trademark wry grin, simply shrugged. "Fear's exhausting," he said. "You ever try being terrified 24/7? It's a lot of work. Honestly, I prefer sarcasm." His response wasn't a rejection of Zelora's power. It was a quiet acknowledgement that power, when based solely on fear, was fragile. His fearlessness wasn't born from a lack of understanding or recklessness, it was born from a deep understanding of life's fragility, of how fleeting power could be. "You think fear is the greatest tool you can wield?" he challenged. "But the truth is, fear is a weakness. True power comes from understanding that it's just an illusion. Fear doesn't last, and it doesn't change anything. The words cut through the air, and as much as Zelora tried to dismiss them, they lingered in the corners of her mind, like an unwanted whisper that wouldn't be silenced. She had built her empire on fear, her entire existence wrapped up in the control it gave her. But Elias had made her question it. There was a deep irony in his presence. Elias, a human, had come from a species that Zelora had long dismissed as weak and insignificant. And yet, it was the same species, the same human that would prove to be her greatest challenge. Not because he had power, but because he understood that fear itself was a lie. Elias Vance wasn't just a man who refused to be afraid, he was a man who understood something that Zelora would have to learn the hard way: fear only controls those who allow it to. And he wasn't one of them. Zelora had never known fear. She was the embodiment of power, the ruler of the Zeith Dominion, an empire built on domination and terror. For centuries, she had reigned supreme, a force so unyielding that her name alone was enough to send entire civilizations into a frenzy of submission. Her empire had been shaped by her ability to strike fear into the hearts of those beneath her, and fear was the foundation on which everything rested. It was the bedrock of her authority. And yet, when she stood before Elias Vance, a human who should have been terrified by the sight of her, the unthinkable happened: he wasn't afraid. In fact, he appeared almost amused by her. Zelora's entire existence had been defined by the control she had over fear. She had destroyed entire worlds, crushed the strongest of warriors, and eradicated species that dared to challenge her. Fear had been her ally, and it was with fear that she had built her empire. But now, standing face to face with this man, this insignificant human, she realized something she had never considered before: there were people who could exist without it, people who weren't ruled by the very force that had made her invincible. And that was a terrifying realization. "Why aren't you afraid, human?" she asked, her voice cold and precise. It was not just a question. It was an accusation, a challenge, and a demand for an answer. Zelora needed to know why this human, who should have been trembling at her presence, wasn't. She needed to understand why he wasn't reacting the way everyone else did. Fear was supposed to be universal. It was the one thing that bound the galaxy together. It was the key to her control, and yet here was Elias, unshaken, unmoved, and most infuriatingly unafraid. The silence between them stretched, the weight of her question hanging heavily in the air. For a moment, Zelora could only watch him, her mind racing. What was it about him that made him immune to fear? Was it arrogance? Was he too foolish to understand the danger he was in? Or was there something more? She had dealt with rebels, warriors, and kings, but none had ever stood before her with such unflinching calm. None had ever dared to look her in the eye with such casual disdain. Elias, for his part, seemed to take his time answering. He didn't cower, didn't plead, didn't make any attempt to beg for mercy. He didn't even show the slightest hint of fear. Instead, he met her gaze with a steady, unblinking stare, his lips curling into a small, knowing smile. It was as if the thought of being intimidated by her never even crossed his mind. "Why aren't you afraid?" Zelora pressed again, her voice now sharp with frustration. The question had been asked, but she needed an answer, needed to understand why he wasn't reacting the way he was supposed to. She had always been able to manipulate fear, to break people with it. But this human, this strange, irreverent man was different. Elias finally spoke, his voice light and easy, as if they were simply having a casual conversation. "I've had worse Mondays," he said with a shrug, his tone casual, as though he were commenting on the weather or asking for directions. There was no fear, no respect, No awe in his voice, just an almost playful indifference. Zelora's breath caught in her chest. His words were simple, yet they struck a chord deep within her. She had been expecting something else. She had been prepared for fear, for begging, for pleading. But instead, she was confronted with a calmness so deep it felt almost alien to her. It wasn't the indifference of a coward, it was the indifference of someone who had seen through the illusion of fear and refused to be bound by it. It was a response that challenged everything Zelora had ever known. She couldn't understand it. Fear was supposed to be the ultimate weapon, the thing that rendered people powerless in her presence. It had always worked before, so why wasn't it working now? Elias wasn't just defying her, he was defying the very thing that had made her invincible. He wasn't afraid, and that, in itself, was more powerful than anything she had ever faced. As the seconds passed, Zelora's frustration grew. She took a step closer to him, her armored boots clicking sharply against the cold floor. She could feel the anger rising within her, but more than that, she could feel something else, something unfamiliar. There was an unsettling feeling in the pit of her stomach, something that threatened to unravel the certainty she had built her empire on. She had never been forced to question her power, never had to confront the possibility that fear might not be the ultimate tool of control. You stand before me, the Supreme Warlord of the Zeith Dominion, and you're not afraid, she said, her voice low, almost menacing. You should be on your knees. Elias looked down, then back up at her, his gaze steady. I don't know, he said with a slight grin. Kneeling's not really my thing. Bad for the spine, you know. I do yoga sometimes. Zelora felt a flicker of something in her chest. It wasn't anger, though she was angry. It wasn't fear, though she was afraid of what this could mean. It was something deeper, something that gnawed at her like a splinter she couldn't remove. Elias wasn't just standing up to her, he was making her question everything she had ever known about power, about fear, and about what it meant to rule. He wasn't intimidated, and worse, he wasn't even interested in being intimidated. His indifference wasn't the weakness she had always believed it to be, it was a strength she couldn't comprehend. For the first time in centuries, Zelora found herself at a loss for words. The question still lingered in the air, why aren't you afraid? But this time, it wasn't just a question for Elias. It was a question for herself, one she hadn't considered until now. How had she come to rely so heavily on fear? Was it truly the ultimate power, or had she been deceived all along? The silence between them stretched, and in that silence, Zelora began to realize that Elias's lack of fear was not just a challenge, it was a mirror, reflecting back at her the very thing she had never dared to confront. The very thing that had made her invincible might, in fact, be the thing that would bring her empire to its knees. Zelora's fury was unlike anything Elias had ever encountered. It wasn't the kind of anger that came with shouting or rash actions. No, her anger was cold, calculated, and restrained, a force that simmered beneath the surface, controlled with terrifying precision. But now, standing before this human who had dared to mock her power, that fury was beginning to boil over. Elias could see it in her eyes, the sharpness in her gaze, the tightening of her posture, the barely contained tension that crackled in the air around them. She wasn't just angry, she was challenged. For centuries, Zelora had ruled with an iron fist, and fear had always been her tool. The universe had bent to her will because they were terrified of the wrath she could unleash. And yet here, now, before Elias Vance, she was faced with something she had never experienced, someone who was immune to her terror. It was as if the foundation of her empire was beginning to crack, the walls she had so meticulously built around her power starting to crumble. And she hated it. She hated the vulnerability it exposed. She hated that this insignificant human had the audacity to make her question everything she knew about control, about power, about her very purpose as the Supreme Warlord of the Zeith Dominion. Her hand twitched at her side, a barely perceptible movement that betrayed the calm exterior she so carefully maintained. The warlords who stood by her, always ready to enforce her will, remained still, sensing the storm that was brewing within their leader. They, too, had never seen her like this, shaken by the presence of a single prisoner. Her fury, once so powerful and unyielding, was now something else. It was not just anger, it was fear. Fear that she might be losing control, that something was slipping from her grasp that she couldn't get back. "Do you mock me, human?" she asked, her voice steady, but there was an underlying tremor in it. The words were like a sharp blade, cutting through the silence that had enveloped the room. The question wasn't just an inquiry, it was an accusation, an attempt to force Elias into submission. But Elias, despite the growing tension, didn't flinch. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if considering her question with amusement, not fear. His smirk never faltered, and in that moment, he seemed less like a prisoner and more like someone who was completely untouchable. "Mock you?" Elias said, his voice light and playful, almost as if they were discussing a trivial matter. "Not at all. I'm just here for the show. It's quite the spectacle you've got going on. The whole warlord thing? Very intimidating." Zelora's eyes narrowed as her control slipped further. She took a step toward him, her boots clicking sharply on the metal floor. The space between them, once neutral, now crackled with tension, her fury filling the air like an electric storm. She could feel the anger rising in her chest, a fire that threatened to consume her composure. How dare he? How dare this insignificant creature stand before her, not in fear, but with an almost mocking indifference? The warlords at her side began to shift, sensing the potential for violence. Their eyes flicked toward each other, but none of them dared to move. Zelora was the one in charge. Zelora was the one who commanded their loyalty through fear. But Elias, he was different. His resistance was a quiet, subtle defiance that made her question whether she truly held all the power she thought she did. Zelora's hand clenched into a fist, the sharp edges of her gauntlet digging into her palm. "You are nothing," she said, her voice low and dangerous, almost a whisper. "I have destroyed entire civilizations for less than what you've done today." Her words were not just a threat, they were a statement of fact, a reminder of the unassailable might she wielded. She had crushed countless enemies under the weight of her power, and Elias would be no different. But Elias only laughed. It was a deep, unsettling sound, one that made Zelora's blood boil with even more fury. How dare he laugh at her? How dare he make light of the destruction she had caused, of the power she had amassed? "Yeah, I know. You're the big, bad warlord, and I'm just the guy who's somehow not terrified of you. But here's the thing," Elias said, his tone still unbothered, his smile never faltering. "You can wipe out a planet, you can strike fear into the hearts of kings and queens, but that doesn't make you the strongest." Zelora froze, her breath catching in her throat. There it was again, his refusal to be intimidated, his boldness in the face of overwhelming power. It was something she couldn't comprehend, something that gnawed at her. No one had ever spoken to her like this. No one had ever stood before her without trembling, without feeling the weight of her might bearing down on them. And for the first time in her life, Zelora began to wonder if Elias was right. What did make her strong, really? Was it the fear she instilled in others? Or was it something deeper? She stepped forward again, this time her voice a whisper, but it was laced with a deadly promise. You will kneel before me, she said, her words a command, an absolute demand. You will submit to my power, or you will be erased. Elias met her gaze, his eyes locked onto hers with a cool, unflinching defiance. I'm not gonna kneel, he said simply. And I don't think you're going to kill me either. The words hit Zelora like a physical blow. The audacity of this man, the certainty in his voice, was like a hammer striking the foundations of her empire. The walls she had built around her, the ones reinforced with fear, were beginning to crumble. For the first time in her life, she questioned her own authority. She could destroy him, yes, but would that truly break him? Would it stop his words from echoing in her mind, from rattling her sense of power? Her fist tightened even more, the gauntlet scraping against her skin. The room was thick with tension, her fury building to a breaking point. This human, this inconsequential human, had not just defied her, he had made her doubt herself. And that, more than anything else, was the greatest defiance of all. Zelora stood there, poised to strike, but for the first time in her reign, something held her back. It wasn't fear, it was something else. Something Elias had awakened within her. She couldn't destroy him. Not yet. Not while the question of her own power lingered in the air, unanswered. Elias Vance had become something she could never have predicted, a challenge not to her strength, but to her very understanding of what it meant to be in control. Elias Vance wasn't just resisting Zelora's power, he was doing something far more dangerous. He was forcing her to confront the very nature of her control, unraveling the foundation on which her empire had been built. He wasn't a mere rebel, fighting against a tyrant. He wasn't a hero with some grand destiny. He was just a man, a human, who had learned to do the impossible. He had learned to live without fear, and in doing so, he challenged the very thing that gave Zelora her strength. Fear was the pillar of Zelora's reign. It was the tool she wielded like a master, bending galaxies, breaking hearts, and dominating minds. She understood fear in ways that no one else could. She could see it in the eyes of her enemies, feel it in the air around her, taste it in the silence that followed her every command. Fear was her weapon. Fear made her invincible. It was not just about annihilating her enemies, it was about making them crumble before her, surrendering their will and spirit to the crushing weight of terror. But Elias Vance, this insignificant human, had flipped that dynamic on its head. His resilience, his refusal to submit, was the very thing that threatened to destabilize everything she had built. Zelora, the Supreme Warlord of the Zeith Dominion, had been brought to the precipice of her own downfall not by an army, not by a fleet of ships, but by a single man who had the audacity to stand before her without fear. The thought should have been laughable. Who could possibly challenge the overwhelming might of her empire? But Elias wasn't just any man. He had something that made him different, something that made him dangerous. He had an unyielding spirit, a defiance that wasn't born of pride, but of a deeper understanding. And that, more than anything else, terrified Zelora. When she first encountered him, she thought it was a fluke, a mere quirk of his personality. He was calm, yes, but perhaps it was the arrogance of a fool, someone who didn't understand the gravity of his situation. But as the days passed, she realized this wasn't arrogance, it was something more profound. Elias was no fool. He had seen the darkness, experienced loss, faced death head-on. He had lived through things that most people could never comprehend, and yet, instead of allowing those experiences to break him, he had emerged stronger, more resolute, and most unsettling of all, unafraid. Every time Zelora tried to assert her dominance, to remind him of her power, Elias met her with calm. It wasn't defiance for the sake of defiance, it was an unwavering confidence in his own survival. He didn't need to resist with strength or weapons. He didn't need to fight fire with fire. All he needed to do was refuse to bow to the one thing that had always controlled the universe: fear. Fear was meant to break the will of those who stood before her, yet Elias seemed to thrive in its presence. He welcomed it, not as an enemy, but as a companion he had learned to live with, to endure, and to rise above. For Zelora, the idea of living without fear was incomprehensible. Fear was what made people small, what made them easy to manipulate, easy to control. It was the tool she had used to command civilizations, to force entire species to their knees. She had built her empire on the understanding that fear was the most primal emotion, the one thing that no living being could escape. Fear made them human, made them weak, and she had mastered how to use it. But Elias was different. His resilience was not a refusal of fear, it was a rejection of the idea that fear had any power over him. Every time Zelora attempted to make him understand the gravity of his situation, she only reinforced his belief that fear wasn't the final word. The more she tried to impose her will on him, the more she realized that it wasn't just her authority that he rejected, it was the entire concept of fear as a tool of control. Elias didn't need to destroy her. He didn't need to fight her armies or tear down her empire. All he had to do was stand tall, unafraid, and watch as her foundation crumbled around her. There was an eerie quiet that followed Elias wherever he went, a calmness that seemed to radiate from him, even in the face of unimaginable danger. His presence was unsettling, not because it was threatening, but because it was so unlike anything Zelora had ever experienced. The bravest warriors she had ever faced had quaked in her presence, their knees shaking with fear. The most powerful leaders of other worlds had bowed before her, unable to withstand the weight of her terror. But Elias? He stood there as if he was completely untouched by her power. It was not arrogance, it was something far deeper. It was the understanding that fear was not the ultimate enemy, it was a tool, a fleeting sensation that could be conquered if one simply chose to do so. Zelora began to question herself in a way she never had before. The walls she had built around her empire, around her power, had always been reinforced by fear. Fear had been the key to everything: her success, her authority, her unassailable position in the galaxy. But Elias's resilience, his refusal to be governed by fear, had exposed the fragility of that structure. Fear, she realized, was not invincible. It could be overcome. And if that was true, then her reign, which had seemed unshakable for so long, might not be as secure as she believed. Elias didn't speak much about the past, about the things that had shaped him, but in his silence, in his calm, there was a profound message. He had learned that true strength didn't come from the absence of fear, it came from the ability to face it, to acknowledge it, and to rise above it. Fear was a shadow, a fleeting thing, and when you stopped running from it, it lost its power. Elias wasn't just a prisoner, he was a living testament to the idea that the greatest enemy of all was not the one who stood before you, but the one that lurked within your own mind. For the first time in Zelora's life, she questioned the very foundation of her power. She had been the conqueror, the unchallenged ruler, but in Elias's defiance, she saw something far more powerful than any fleet, any weapon, or any army. She saw a man who was unbroken, unbowed, and unafraid. And that, more than anything else, was the real challenge to her reign. As the days passed aboard the Exaltus, Zelora's unease about Elias Vance grew. She had conquered countless systems, each one falling to her unmatched strength, her ability to wield fear like a weapon. Yet this human, this single man, had managed to expose a weakness she had never considered. His refusal to succumb to her power, to fear her as every other being in the galaxy had, unsettled her in ways she couldn't quite grasp. But there was something else that gnawed at her, a sensation that there was more to him than met the eye, something beneath the surface she hadn't yet understood. Elias was not only defying her, he was challenging everything she thought she knew about the very fabric of power. It wasn't until a seemingly ordinary evening, when the ship's systems hummed with their usual eerie quiet, that Zelora's suspicion was confirmed in a way she never expected. It began as a faint anomaly, a strange flicker in the ship's energy grid that at first seemed insignificant. But as the hours passed, the anomaly grew stronger, and a deeper sense of disturbance filled the air. The Exaltus, her flagship, was a ship unlike any other. Massive, imposing, it was the symbol of her empire's might. Its technology was unmatched, and its core systems had been designed for one purpose, to maintain her absolute control over the galaxy. Yet now, that very ship was beginning to betray her. Something outside of her control, was tampering with the very systems she had entrusted her empire to. Zelora's first instinct was to dismiss it, to think of it as a malfunction or a simple glitch. After all, even the most advanced technologies could falter. But as the anomaly continued to grow in intensity, her unease turned to something far worse. She felt a subtle vibration in the air around her, the very walls of the ship seeming to hum with an unfamiliar resonance. The energy readings in the command center began to fluctuate wildly, and soon, her personal AI system, X-19, was alerting her to something extraordinary. Supreme One, the anomaly in the lower detention levels is unlike any we've ever encountered. The energy signature is not from any known technology in our database. It appears to be, the AI's voice paused, the words coming out with a hint of uncertainty that made Zelora's blood run cold. "Explain yourself," she demanded, her voice sharp, but even she could hear the edge of tension creeping in. "It appears to be, organic in nature. Its source is originating from within the prisoner's cell," the AI finally finished. The words hit her like a physical blow. Elias? It had to be Elias. For the first time, Zelora's mind shifted from uncertainty to a deep, chilling realization. This wasn't a malfunction. This wasn't some random glitch. The source of this disruption was him. The human who had so casually stood before her and mocked her rule was now altering the very ship that had once been her unyielding fortress. Zelora's breath caught in her chest as she turned to face the display screens, which now showed multiple energy surges in the lower levels of the ship. She felt an unfamiliar twinge of panic grip her as she ordered the guards to investigate. As they made their way to Elias's cell, the systems of the Exaltus continued to destabilize, the energy around her flickering as though the ship itself were reacting to something it couldn't comprehend. It was a subtle change, but the effect was undeniable. Zelora could sense it, a deep, almost primal force beginning to seep into the very walls of her ship, a power that had no place in her meticulously crafted empire. When the guards arrived at the cell, they found something unimaginable. The force fields that were designed to contain even the most powerful beings in the galaxy were flickering erratically, their energy reserves depleting faster than they could replenish. Elias stood in the center of the cell, his hands unbound, and around him, the air shimmered with an unnatural glow. The energy was not just fluctuating, it was being generated by him, flowing from him as if his very presence was altering the laws of physics. Zelora felt the sensation reverberate through the ship as though its very soul were being corrupted. She felt it in her bones, a deep unease, a realization that she was no longer in control. "Release him," Zelora ordered, her voice barely a whisper, as if saying the words out loud might somehow make this madness real. Her warlords were hesitant, standing at attention but unsure of how to proceed. They had never seen anything like this. The Exultus, her flagship, was a masterpiece of war and technology, but it was now shaking under the strain of something beyond its design. They had never encountered anything capable of affecting the ship's systems like this. The detainment cells, once perfect in their containment, were now powerless in the face of Elias's power. And with every passing second, it became more evident, Elias was not just a prisoner. He was something more. Something dangerous. Zelora strode to the cell herself, her eyes narrowed in fury and disbelief. As she entered the room, she could feel the power radiating from Elias. It was no longer just an energy field, it was as though his very essence was infused with something alien, something not of this universe. His calm gaze met hers, and for the first time in her life, Zelora felt her invincibility waver. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice raw with both frustration and awe. "What are you?" Elias looked at her with an unbothered smile, as though his very presence had become an amusement. He was no longer the prisoner she had thought he was. He was something much older, much more ancient than anything Zelora had ever encountered. "I told you, Zelora," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 secrets, "you've been playing with the wrong toy for far too long." He stretched his hand out slightly, the energy around him flickering again as the walls of the cell shuddered. "This is not my power. It's a power far older than anything you can understand. You think you control everything, but you don't even know the forces you're toying with." The full weight of his words hit her like a punch to the gut. This human, this man she had underestimated, was not just defying her. He was releasing something. Something ancient and powerful. The technology Zelora had relied on to maintain her empire, her control, was now meaningless in the face of Elias's abilities. His power was not from machines or weapons. It was from something primal, something beyond the boundaries of the Empire's understanding. As the energy around Elias surged, Zelora realized the truth. For the first time in her life, she was not in control. The very ship that had been built to carry her through the stars, to crush her enemies, was now trembling beneath the weight of a force that had no place in her galaxy. And this force, this human, was challenging everything she had ever known about power, fear, and control. Elias Vance was not just a prisoner. He was a harbinger of a power that could destroy everything she had built. And for the first time, Zelora felt the cold grip of uncertainty tighten around her heart. The truth had been staring Zelora in the face all along, but she had been too consumed by her own power, her own certainty, to see it. Elias Vance was not just a human, he was something far beyond the comprehension of her empire, a force that defied everything she had ever known about control, strength, and authority. As the power emanated from him, the very walls of the Exulta seemed to tremble, as if the ship itself was becoming aware of the anomaly it had been carrying. Zelora had always believed herself to be unassailable. She had built her empire on fear, and in her eyes, fear was the ultimate weapon. It had served her well, forcing civilizations to bow, breaking those who stood against her. She had crushed rebellions with a single word, annihilated fleets with a mere gesture. Fear had been the glue that held everything together, and it was the foundation upon which her rule was built. For centuries, she had been the unquestioned ruler of the galaxy, a force of nature that no one dared defy. But here, in the silence of her flagship, she stood face to face with a man who did not fear her. Worse yet, a man whose power was slowly unraveling everything she had worked for. As Elias stood before her, the air around him seemed to ripple with an energy she couldn't understand. It wasn't like anything she had ever seen before. The power that flowed from him was not of this galaxy, nor of any technology she had at her disposal. His very presence bent the laws of nature, warping the fabric of the Exaltus' systems, pulling them out of alignment, making her feel like a stranger in her own ship. The energy that radiated from him was organic, alive like a force of nature that had been harnessed, but not created by any technology. Elias was not just an ordinary human. He was something older, something that had been hidden for far too long. Zelora had seen her share of warriors, kings, and tyrants, people who had harnessed great power, often through weapons or technology, sometimes even by sheer force of will. But none of them had been like Elias. None had stood before her with such defiance, with a calm certainty that cut through the very core of her belief system. She had tried to break him with fear, but instead, he had broken her perception of what power truly was. It wasn't just that he refused to bend to her will, it was the way his power undid hers, like a crack slowly forming in the foundation of an unshakable tower. Zelora's heart pounded in her chest as the realization began to sink in. Elias was not just a prisoner. He was a conduit of something ancient, something primal, a force that had been hidden beneath the surface of the universe, waiting for the right moment to be unleashed. The more she thought about it, the more everything about Elias began to make sense in a way that terrified her. He was not just resisting her, he was releasing something that had never been part of her empire's calculations. The power he controlled was not from her galaxy, and it was not bound by the laws of science and technology she had mastered. It was something beyond her understanding, beyond the reach of her might. Elias's smile only deepened as he saw the realization dawning in Zelora's eyes. He didn't need to say anything, his presence, his energy, spoke for him. She could feel it now, this overwhelming presence that filled the room, the Exaltus itself. The ship had been built as a symbol of absolute control, yet now it was being undone from within. The once indomitable fortress that had carried Zelora's might across the galaxy was now buckling under the strain of Elias's power. She felt the walls closing in, the sensation that she was being trapped inside her own creation, her own empire. The thing she had relied on for centuries to hold the galaxy in place was now slipping through her fingers, all because of one man. The calm, almost detached expression on Elias's face was the final blow. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't even concerned. He stood there as if he knew something she didn't, as if he was certain that whatever power he wielded was enough to defeat her. And for the first time, Zelora felt an emotion she had never allowed herself to feel: doubt. The realization that she, the Supreme Warlord of the Zeith Dominion, was not the most powerful being in the galaxy, was a bitter pill to swallow. She had spent so many years thinking she was the one who controlled everything, thinking that no one could ever challenge her. But now she was faced with a man who had made her question everything. Everything she had built, everything she had believed, was slowly unraveling in front of her eyes. Elias's power wasn't just physical, it was something more. It was a force that seemed to resonate with the very core of existence. He was tapping into something ancient, something that had been hidden from the universe for eons. It was as if the universe itself had been waiting for someone like Elias to awaken it. The power he possessed was not a weapon, it was an existence, a presence that transcended anything Zelora had ever known. Zelora's vision blurred for a moment, and she felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. She had always believed in her own invincibility, in the certainty of her power. But now, as she stood before Elias, she realized that certainty was nothing more than an illusion. The truth was that she was not the end-all be-all of existence. She was a product of her time, a being who had been shaped by the fear she controlled. But Elias was something else. He was a force of nature that could not be bound by fear, and that terrified Zelora more than any weapon or fleet she had ever commanded. Elias, however, remained unaffected. His energy flickered again, a subtle shift in the air around him. He looked at her, his gaze calm, but there was something deeper in his eyes, something ancient, something that spoke of untold knowledge and power. "You've built your empire on fear, Zelora," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "But fear doesn't last. It fades. It's fragile. What I control, what I've always controlled, is far stronger than fear. And that's what will bring your empire down." Zelora felt the ground shift beneath her. The walls that had once felt so sturdy now felt fragile, as if everything she had built, everything she had trusted, was beginning to crack. Elias had revealed something that she couldn't ignore. He wasn't just a prisoner. He was a force, a being beyond her understanding, and he had awakened a truth that she couldn't deny. The power of fear was nothing compared to the power he commanded. And now, she had no choice but to face the consequences of her own hubris. Zelora stood in the command center of the Exaltus, her mind swirling in a storm of conflicting emotions. She had spent centuries building her empire on the belief that fear was the ultimate tool of control. Fear had been the very core of her power, the force that had brought entire civilizations to their knees, that had shattered the will of kings, and that had made her a name whispered in terror across the galaxy. It was her greatest weapon, and it had never failed her until now. Elias Vance, the human prisoner who had so casually mocked her power, had shattered that illusion. The calm defiance in his eyes, the unwavering indifference he showed in the face of her wrath, had cut through her certainty like a blade. Zelora had always believed that fear was the one thing that no living being could resist. But Elias had shown her something she had never considered: not all fear can be controlled, and not all people will bow to it. The more she thought about it, the more unsettling it became. The more she tried to impose her will on him, the more she realized that it wasn't just her rule he was challenging, it was the very nature of power itself. He wasn't just defying her. He was rejecting the idea that fear could dominate him, rejecting the notion that her power could bend him. In his eyes, there was no terror, no trembling before her might. He stood before her as though she were just another obstacle to be ignored, another meaningless threat. And the weight of that defiance, that refusal to submit, was a challenge she hadn't known how to face. It had all come to a head in that moment. Elias's calm, his casual indifference, had broken through her defenses. "You don't scare me," he had said, the words as simple as they were damning. There was no defiance in his tone, no anger, no fury. There was just an unmistakable truth in his voice, as though he knew something she didn't. And that was the problem. He knew something about power that she didn't, something that she had spent centuries denying. Zelora's mind raced as the meaning of his words settled into her thoughts. She had spent her life building her empire on the foundation of fear, yet here was a human, a species she had long dismissed as weak and insignificant, standing before her, unmoved by the terror she could unleash. His words weren't just a rejection of her, they were a rejection of everything she had believed in. The very concept of fear, the idea that she could command it, was being torn apart by this one human. The more she thought about it, the more a seed of doubt grew within her, a doubt she couldn't ignore. What if he was right? What if fear, the thing that had kept her in power for so long, was nothing more than an illusion? What if it didn't have the hold on people that she thought it did? The thought was enough to make her breath catch in her throat. Fear had always been her greatest ally, and yet here was someone who had stood against it without flinching. And that, in itself, was more dangerous than any weapon or army she could command. She turned to face him, her crimson eyes narrowing as she stepped closer, her boots echoing in the cold silence of the chamber. Elias didn't flinch, didn't back away. He just stood there, calm, as though nothing in the universe could touch him. There was something unnerving about it, something that cut deeper than any threat she could make. Zelora had never faced an enemy who didn't tremble at the thought of her. She had never had to deal with someone who wasn't afraid to look her in the eye and speak so casually in the face of her power. "You stand before me, human," she said, her voice low, but with an edge that could have cut steel. "The Supreme Warlord of the Zeith Dominion. You have no idea what you are up against." Her words were laced with the full weight of her authority, but even as they left her mouth, she felt something shift. A tremor of uncertainty. She had been the one in control for so long, but now she was the one who felt vulnerable. Elias's response came with a slow, almost bored shrug. "Yeah, I know. You're the big bad warlord, right? The one who can wipe out entire fleets with a thought." His tone was mocking, but there was no fear in it. No respect. Just a casual dismissal of everything she had built. "You think you can intimidate me with your threats," he continued, his eyes not leaving hers. "You think I'm afraid of you because you've destroyed a few planets? Big deal. Been there, done that." Zelora's blood boiled. This was not how it was supposed to be. She was the one who was supposed to inspire terror. She was the one who was supposed to make them bow before her. Yet here was Elias, unbroken, unbowed, and utterly unaffected by her threats. His words weren't those of a fool, they were the words of someone who had seen it all, who had experienced the kind of darkness that made fear seem trivial. She took another step forward, her gaze locking with his. "You think you're untouchable, don't you?" she spat, her voice thick with venom. "You think you can stand here and mock me, challenge me, without consequences?" Her words were sharp as a dagger, her anger flaring like wildfire. Elias's gaze didn't waver. He wasn't afraid, but neither was he angry. He was simply unconcerned. "No," he said slowly. "I don't think I'm untouchable. But I know this, your fear doesn't work on me. You can try to intimidate me, try to make me submit. But I won't. I'm not afraid of you, Zelora. And that's what makes you dangerous." For a moment, the weight of his words hung in the air. Zelora stood frozen, her anger dissipating, replaced by something far more unsettling: uncertainty. Elias had spoken the truth. The power she had relied on for so long, the power she had used to build her empire, was meaningless in the face of someone who refused to be controlled by it. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Elias's resilience wasn't just about his ability to resist her. He had shown her that fear, her greatest weapon, was nothing but an illusion. For the first time in her life, Zelora felt the grip of fear tighten around her, not the fear of others, but the fear of losing control. And in that moment, she realized that her greatest enemy wasn't just a human standing before her. It was the fear that she had never allowed herself to question, the fear that, in the end, might be her undoing. For centuries, Zelora had ruled with the certainty that fear was the ultimate power. She had used it to shape the galaxy, to break its will and bend it to her own. She had been a force of nature, an unstoppable tidal wave of destruction that washed away entire civilizations, leaving only the ruins of their terrorized remains. Her warlords, her armies, her fleets all had been instruments of her reign, and all had been bound by the same singular truth: fear was the most powerful tool she could wield. Fear made her invincible. Fear was her weapon, and she had wielded it with unparalleled mastery. But standing before Elias Vance, something deep inside Zelora began to unravel. The man who had been captured, who had once been nothing more than an insignificant prisoner, had become her greatest challenge. And it wasn't his strength that made him dangerous, it was his utter lack of fear. He stood before her, unflinching, unbowed, completely unaffected by the terror she could unleash. For the first time in her life, Zelora realized that the one thing she had relied on to secure her rule, the thing that had been the foundation of her power, might not be as absolute as she had believed. It wasn't just that Elias refused to be afraid, it was that his refusal made her question the very nature of her rule. Every time she threatened him, every time she tried to instill fear into his heart, he simply met her with calm, unwavering defiance. There was no terror in his eyes, no desperation, no trembling under the weight of her wrath. There was only a quiet certainty that she couldn't touch, couldn't break. And that certainty struck her in a way she had never experienced before. Zelora had always believed that fear was something she controlled, that it was an unyielding force that could be bent to her will. But Elias had shown her that fear could be defeated, not by strength or weapons, but by the sheer will to live without it. His calmness was not a sign of weakness, as she had once thought. It was a sign of something far more dangerous: his understanding that fear was not a natural law of the universe, but a construct. A construct that could be overcome. As she stood in front of him, the weight of his defiance pressing against her, something began to shift within Zelora. The walls she had built around herself, walls of terror and control, began to feel fragile, almost as if they were crumbling beneath the force of her own doubt. It was as if a mirror had been held up to her, and she was now seeing herself and her empire for the first time, stripped of the illusion that had kept her untouchable for so long. She had built her entire empire on fear, but Elias had shown her that fear could be rejected. It wasn't an inevitable force, it was a choice. And the moment that realization hit her, she felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Fear, once her greatest ally, now felt like a shackle. She had lived her entire life in its grip, thinking it was the key to her strength. But what if she had been wrong? What if fear wasn't the answer? What if the true source of power lay in something else entirely? Zelora's mind raced as the full scope of her transformation began to dawn on her. She had always believed in her own invincibility. She had built an empire that spanned across the stars, one that no one could challenge. Her power was absolute, or so she had thought. But Elias had shown her that power built on fear was fragile, and she had been living in the illusion of strength for far too long. His resistance, his lack of fear, had exposed the cracks in her foundation. And now, for the first time in her life, she was standing at the edge of something she couldn't control. The calmness she had always projected, the fear she had inspired in others, was no longer enough. She had thought she was invulnerable, but now, she felt vulnerable. Her grip on the galaxy, once so tight and sure, was slipping. Elias had done something she hadn't thought possible. He had made her question everything she had built. And that question lingered in the air, unspoken but undeniable: what if I'd been wrong all along? Zelora's transformation was not immediate. It wasn't something that happened in a single moment, nor was it something she could fully embrace all at once. It was a slow, painful unraveling of the very core of her being. The certainty she had lived with for so long, the certainty that fear was the ultimate power, began to fade, replaced by a nagging, gnawing sense of doubt. She had always believed that fear was the force that made her untouchable, the thing that kept her on top, the thing that made others bend to her will. But now, Elias's indifference had shattered that belief. And in its place, a new understanding was beginning to take shape, one that scared her more than anything else. For the first time, Zelora began to feel what it was like to be human. To question. To doubt. To be uncertain of her place in the universe. It was a feeling she had never allowed herself to experience. She had always been the one in control, the one who dictated the terms, who crushed anyone who dared defy her. But now, she wasn't so sure. Elias had opened her eyes to the possibility that power wasn't about control. It wasn't about fear. It was about something deeper, something she couldn't put into words yet, but something she knew could change everything. Her gaze met Elias's, and for the first time, she saw him not as a prisoner, not as an obstacle to be crushed, but as something more. He wasn't just a man who had resisted her power. He was a mirror. A mirror reflecting back at her the truth she had been avoiding. That truth was both terrifying and liberating. Fear, the thing she had relied on to shape the galaxy, wasn't the answer. The answer, she realized, lay in something else, a strength that didn't come from dominating others, but from understanding them, from seeing beyond the surface and realizing that even she, the great warlord, was not invulnerable. The moment of clarity hit Zelora with the force of a star crashing into the heart of her empire. She had spent so long building her reign on the foundation of fear, but Elias had shattered that foundation with his simple, unwavering defiance. And in that moment, Zelora understood true power wasn't about instilling fear in others. True power came from embracing the very thing she had spent her life trying to suppress, vulnerability. For the first time in centuries, Zelora stood at a precipice, one that she hadn't seen coming, one she didn't know how to navigate. She had spent her entire life building an empire on the unshakable belief that fear was the ultimate weapon. Fear had been her tool, her constant companion, and the force that had secured her reign across the galaxy. It had shaped her into the person she had become, a ruler who commanded absolute obedience, a conqueror whose word was law, a warlord whose very presence could make the strongest tremble. But now, as she stood before Elias Vance, everything she had known about power, about control, about herself, was crumbling. His unyielding defiance, his refusal to bow before her, had chipped away at the walls of her certainty. The illusion of invincibility she had so carefully crafted was now a fragile thing, and for the first time in her life, she was beginning to question the foundation of her empire. Fear, the very thing she had relied on to build her dominion, had been turned against her. And Elias, a mere human, had exposed it. Zelora's mind raced as she stared at Elias. He had come into her life as a prisoner, someone she had underestimated, someone she thought she could crush with ease. But now, he had become something far more dangerous, a force of change, an agent of disruption who had made her question everything she had built. His words echoed in her mind, not as threats, but as truths. Fear was not the answer. Fear was not what kept her in power. And the realization had shaken her to her core. But the question that haunted her, the one that lingered in the air, was not just about Elias or his defiance. The question was about her. What would she do now? For so long, Zelora had believed that power came from dominance, from control, from breaking others under the weight of fear. She had built an empire founded on the notion that the strongest ruled, and the weakest submitted. She had conquered galaxies, crushed rebellions, and destroyed entire species. But now, standing in front of Elias, she realized how fragile that power truly was. She had lived her life with the certainty that fear would always keep her at the top, but Elias had shown her that it was possible to live without it, to be stronger than fear itself. The truth hit her like a wave crashing over the shore, relentless and unyielding. Power, true power, was not about controlling others through fear. It was about something deeper, something that transcended all the physical forces of the universe. It was about understanding, about knowing that strength did not come from domination, but from the ability to let go of the need to control. It was about vulnerability, and about standing firm in the face of the unknown without succumbing to the overwhelming urge to subjugate others. Zelora had spent her entire life suppressing that vulnerability, convinced that it was a weakness. She had been so focused on maintaining her grip on the galaxy, on ensuring that no one could ever challenge her, that she had never stopped to consider the possibility that true strength might lie in letting go of the fear that had defined her. But Elias had forced her to see it, to understand it in a way that terrified her. What was she supposed to do now? The answer was not simple, and it certainly wasn't one that she could give easily. Her entire existence, her empire, was built on the belief that fear was the answer. But Elias had made her realize that fear was not the solution to every problem. In fact, fear had been the cause of many of her greatest mistakes. It had kept her from seeing beyond her own walls, beyond her own limitations. It had blinded her to the possibility of a different kind of strength, one that didn't rely on the destruction of others. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. The empire she had built, the legacy she had fought so hard to create, was now at a crossroads. The fear that had once kept her in power had become a chain, one that was now holding her back. If she continued down this path, if she continued to rule with fear and control, she would only find herself more isolated, more vulnerable. But if she embraced this new understanding, if she chose to release the grip that fear had over her, she would have to face the unknown. She would have to surrender the certainty she had relied on for so long. The weight of that decision was unbearable. Could she change? Could she, Zelora, the Supreme Warlord of the Zeith Dominion, the conqueror of galaxies, truly let go of the fear that had defined her entire existence? Could she allow herself to become something more than just a ruler who ruled with an iron fist? For the first time, she found herself at a loss for words. She had always known what she wanted, what she needed. But now, as she looked at Elias, something inside her shifted. The certainty that had always been her greatest strength was now her greatest weakness. The question that she had never asked herself, "What would you do now?" was one she could no longer ignore. Elias's defiance had opened a door that Zelora had never known existed. And now, as she stood before him, she realized that the answer to that question lay not in her ability to destroy him, but in her ability to face her own fears, to let go of the need for control, and to embrace a new kind of power. A power that didn't rely on domination, but on understanding. A power that didn't thrive on fear, but on the strength to be vulnerable. The future of her empire, the future of the galaxy, was uncertain. But in that moment, Zelora knew that she could no longer cling to the past. The fear that had made her great was no longer enough. It was time to decide what kind of ruler she would be, and what kind of power she would embrace. And in that decision, everything would change. Zelora's eyes met Elias's once more, and for the first time, she saw him not as a threat, but as the catalyst for her transformation. The final question had been asked, and now it was up to her to answer. A new era began in the wake of Zelora's realization. The empire that had once been built on fear and control was now poised to shift, its foundations shaking beneath the weight of her transformation. For the first time, she understood that true strength was not found in domination, but in understanding. Fear, which had been her weapon for so long, had been replaced by something far more potent: vulnerability, awareness, and a profound connection to the universe and the beings she had once ruled with an iron fist. Zelora had spent her life conquering, crushing all opposition, believing that fear was what kept her on top. But Elias had shown her the cracks in her empire, the fallibility of her own belief system. By standing before her, unafraid and unwavering, he had forced her to confront the very thing that had defined her reign, her reliance on fear. And in doing so, he had shattered her vision of invincibility, offering her a new path, one of growth, of change, and of power built on empathy and trust rather than terror. The galaxy, which had once trembled beneath her, was now looking toward a future shaped not by the cold grip of an iron ruler, but by the warm embrace of a leader who had learned to listen, to learn, and to lead with a strength that came not from fear, but from wisdom and compassion. The transformation was not just in Zelora, it was in the very soul of the galaxy she had once dominated. A new era had dawned, one where the cycle of terror had ended, and the promise of unity, understanding, and a shared future lay on the horizon. Zelora was no longer the tyrant, she was a beacon for the change that was to come.